I'm really excited about this panel because the title tells it all. We're kind of at this phase in time where we're seeing a lot of stuff we read about in books growing up, watching on Star Wars. The technology is actually to the point where it's actually bringing food to our plate in a number of different interesting ways. So that's really what we're gonna have a conversation about. Technologies that, like I said, a couple years ago sounded like they were straight out of a book are here today. And we have assembled this great group of experts to kind of really talk through some of those. And I think you guys are all gonna learn something today. I wanna quickly introduce each panelist, and we're gonna jump into the conversation. I'll let them introduce themselves. To my immediate left is Deputy Undersecretary of the USDA. I think perhaps the youngest ever Deputy Undersecretary of the USDA, Sanah Baig. I had a great time getting to know you a little bit earlier at another conference, and so I'm excited to have you here. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. It's been a really inspirational couple of days. I had a chance to sit in and participate in the ag tech track yesterday and really loved the panel right before this. So just want to thank you for bringing together such fascinating and mission-driven, purposeful leaders. So again, I'm Sanah. I'm the Deputy Undersecretary for Agriculture, and what I do is I help oversee the science mission area for the Department of Agriculture, which a lot of folks might not recognize is a pretty significant part of the USDA. We have an over $4 billion annual budget. About half of that is for intramural research, and the other half we give out, largely to the land-grant university system, academia, community-based organizations, and the private sector. And this conversation around food innovation, science and technology, I just want folks to be able to understand that USDA has been leading the charge and making investments in this space for more than 150 years. So this is part and parcel to what we do. And our biggest goal is to make sure that all of the science and research that we conduct in-house, all that we fund through our partners, doesn't sit on a shelf. Our entire goal is to translate all of that science, data, information into solutions specifically for farmers so they can thrive and they can adapt and they can be profitable, which in the current landscape that we're in is increasingly challenging. And so I might stop there, but a lot more to get into on the science enterprise.
Oh, for sure. I want to hear about how we get some of that science off the shelf and into practical use. And we'll be diving into that in just a little bit. But to your left is Maria Cho, who's the CEO of TripleBar. Maria, tell us a little bit about TripleBar, what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for hosting the panel here. Excited to be on stage with these lovely ladies. So TripleBar is an exciting company where we have invented what's called the microprocessor for biology. Essentially, we have the ability to miniaturize the test tube into a picoliter volume and take tens of millions of individual cells, put it on a chip that fits in the palm of your hand, and then run that chip on a benchtop system. So we truly have miniaturized the test process in biology. What that allows us to do is look at the entire biological design space of an organism or a cell line or a library of antibodies, and then be able to use evolutionary design, so what we call hypothesis-free design, to actually create products in biotech and manufacture them in a more sustainable, climate efficient and friendly way. So we're excited to be a part of the future of food and focusing on a very specific yet critical part of innovation that's needed in the value chain and bringing that to the community.
Great. And to your left is Lisa Dyson, the CEO of Air Protein. Lisa, I've been following your story for years now. It's been a fascinating one to follow. And I guess of all the talking about taking science fiction and putting it on our plate, this idea of taking protein out of thin air just sounds like science fiction. Tell us about Air Protein, what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we were creative with the technology, but not with the name. So we do make protein from elements of the air, so why not call the company Air Protein? And so we are able to make nutrients, essentially using elements of the air, water, and energy as the input. The process is very similar to traditional fermentation, like how you make yogurt or cheese or beer or wine. But the key difference is that we feed in the elements that make up those inputs that you typically would have. So in the case of yogurt, you'd have milk. Milk is made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. We feed in carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. We also feed in nitrogen, which is an element of the air, in order to make something that's different on the back end, which is a nutritious protein ingredient. And with that protein ingredient, it has 80 80+% protein content, all the essential amino acids, rich in vitamins and minerals. You can then use that as a core flour to make a number of products, everything from your pastas to your cereals to alternative meats, alternative dairies, and beyond. So that's what we do.
Great. I mean, we've mentioned it on some of the panels before, and also yesterday in the ag tech track, but I think this isn't just technology flexing its muscles, technology for technology's sake. I think that we realize in the broader food world and in ag that we are going to need these technologies if we can really plan on feeding 10 billion people by 2050. We've kind of almost factored it in that we're going to need these technologies. So, Maria, can you talk a little bit about that? Like where are we on this, and are we making enough breakthroughs to where you think we can feed people, but also consider that we need to kind of slow down the CO2 emissions and cool the planet a little bit? Where are we on this?
Yeah, so I think, the thing that keeps me up at night is how are we going to solve this problem of feeding the world by 2050? And I think we've had, some innovations in the past, some products that you guys might be familiar with. Probably the first one was corn out of the UK, and then pioneers like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat brought alternative, foods to, the mainstream world. But what we are seeing now is really a need to shift from what I like to call the industrial age to the biology age, where we can leverage the tools that we have and that have been used in industry in various ways, but now apply it to food tech and actually create products that we haven't been able to create before, but also in a way that is sustainable and at commercializable cost points so that these products can be brought to the market, broadly and globally. I think we're in a transition where we think of kind of what is the key source of calories that we need to feed the world. And TripleBar are personally focused on proteins and the importance of protein and alternative proteins in the form of ingredients, as well as cultivated meat. So true animal cells that are made into either structured or unstructured meats that can be grown in a bioreactor and then put on our plate. So it really is kind of shifting us from this thought of, going to a grocery store and buying something that came from an animal and going to a grocery store and buying something that came from a bioreactor that is still an animal.
Yeah.
So
I think about this, like the space race back in like the 60s, between the Soviet Union and the US, and how all that innovation came out of that. Fast forward to 25, 30 years, you think about the clean tech revolution and how we really need to there's just tons of billions of dollars that went injected into the space to kind of help kickstart this space. First of all, I want to talk to you, Lisa, and then maybe you, Sanah, about this kind of idea of how the USDA is going to evolve. But your technology, in a way, was born out of that first space race, right? Well, you took technology that was created to help feed people in space, and that was the genesis of what you did. So are we seeing more and more of this technology that is originally catalyzed through innovation either through government investment or whatever, and then making this an actual producible product?
Yeah, so our technology, as you mentioned, is derived from thinking about if you're going to send astronauts on long space journeys, there's not acres and acres of farmland up there. And if they're going to need to produce food on that journey, then how do you do it? How do you do it in a way that's efficient, that's fast, that uses minimal space, minimal resources? And so the benefit of that thinking is, you're thinking outside the box, you're thinking in a different way, you're thinking about solving a problem that we would never envision just here planted feet on earth. And the impact is a way of making food with no arable land required, and it's highly nutritious. It is carbon negative from cradle to gate, so that has a huge benefit from a environmental perspective, and it requires very little water. So looking at NASA in particular and kind of some of the problems that they're trying to solve and reframing them for things that we have to solve here on Earth is a way that innovation definitely comes out into the world.
And Sanah, are you kind of feeling you're at a point now where the government's kind of seeing itself as a way to a catalyzer because we're facing these big crises in the world and we need to kind of rethink the food system?
Oh my gosh, so much to that. So first I want to say is I appreciate what Maria mentioned is that, we talk about Beyond Meat and, first all protein company to IPO, obviously still very early stages in the all protein space. But when I think about the role of government, a lot of people don't know, but the kind of technology to extract that pea protein was in part made possible because of ARS funding, government funding to the University of Missouri. This is one of millions of examples, of how we support this underlying essential technology to ensure that we can create entire new ecosystems and thousands of companies, right, that can compete in the marketplace. And then to Lisa's point, it's a perfect segue actually, because recently we actually renewed our MOU. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and NASA just signed another MOU. We've actually been working together now for more than 10 years, exactly to this point of how do we grow in these really, really, harsh environments, working on things like leafy greens, but also other types of protein, and also that collaboration between agencies. I think a lot of people don't really understand, or maybe don't see that it's not just public-private partnerships, it's public-public partnerships, right? We're working with the National Science Foundation, for example, on a lot of work, and they're funding an incredible amount of work in food innovation, as is USDA. So same thing with ARPA-H. When I look at the Department of Health and Human Services, when I look at the Defense Department, they're all finding linkages and intersections to ensure that we can be more sustainable and innovative, right, to be able to feed soldiers, to be able to feed people in space. So I think that's just a really interesting thing that maybe a lot of people don't know about or don't talk about. But from the, as I mentioned, for 150 years, more than that, USDA has been around. We've been working with the land grant community, working with academics and working with businesses to make sure that we can thrive. Right now, we have this new charge. We have this renewed sense of urgency, right? Especially coming out of the pandemic, which it feels like people don't really even talk about anymore, but that was such a shock to our food system. And I think that got Gen Z in particular so much more aware of kind of how fragile, how fragile things are. And we recognize that, it was mentioned in an earlier panel, that it was an intentional focus by one of the secretaries back in the late 70s or 80s of agriculture to say, we're gonna plant fence row to fence row. Right, and so this hyper focus on yield made the United States the most productive agricultural system in the world. And that has been great for a lot of reasons in lifting millions out of poverty, and it has come at great cost. So now we're rethinking our entire innovation ecosystem to not just focus on supporting production agriculture, which we need, but creating these complementary production systems as well that inherently value nutrition. They inherently value climate smart agriculture practices. And more than anything, I think this is missing in a lot of the conversations, they value equity. And we really want to bring BIPOC farmers, indigenous farmers, Hispanic farmers, young people, veterans to the table, because we need them now more than ever. And they have the power to really bring these innovative technologies and solutions to the food system that maybe wouldn't happen otherwise. And so I heard a comment yesterday where there's a lot of new kind of tech folks entering the ag space, and it kind of had a tinge of, we don't want that, but no, we absolutely want that, and we need that, and we're investing in that in really big ways at USDA.
I do want to touch on that later about the new talent injection, because I think it's happening in a big way and we do need it. But I want to talk a little bit about the biomanufacturing economy. I think the Biden administration certainly has supported that more than any other administration prior to that. And Maria, you're kind of sitting at the epicenter of this early new industry of biomanufacturing. Can you kind of explain to people who are maybe not experts in this space, like what is this and how will it be a creator of new food types and feed more people?
Yeah, no, and it's great, and thank you, Sanah, for your comment. I think there's one of the things that's really important for us to think about is that I don't think we're going to ever really completely replace land-based agriculture. I think there's a role and an important place for biotech to make products that are more sustainable, but that is going to give us an ability to have more products and replace maybe ingredients that are very expensive to make through traditional isolation methods from dairy or other sources, making through biotech, so that more whole dairy can be available to the world. So those are things that we're excited about. But yeah, so just quickly on what is biomanufacturing. So it's basically taking a single cell organism, so a yeast, think about what you use to make beer, or a bacteria, or a mammalian cell. So I always make the joke, because my last name is Cho. Cho is an organism that's used in pharma to make make products. So I'm a multicellular Cho, not a single cellular Cho. But basically, you use these organisms to produce ingredients, or the cell itself may be the product. So in cultivated meat, there are muscle cells or fat cells that are isolated from actual animals through like a biopsy method. And then those cells are then, what we do is we evolve them so that they have the properties to grow in large tanks. And so, where cultivated meat is right now in the industry is, and you've heard, other phrases for what cultivated meat is called, but essentially we are trying to evolve those cells to have those properties to grow in large bioreactor tanks, and then combine muscle cells, fat cells to have that taste, texture profile that you're kind of used to when consuming meat products, but then also better for the environment, right? So we're not having making plants to then feed cows and then having cows that become burgers. We're actually just starting with the source of the cells, combining them to make either like a sausage or a hamburger or even a chicken breast, like what Upside Foods is doing out of Emeryville, right around the corner from us. And so that's essentially what biomanufacturing is. It's utilizing organisms or cells to make a final product in a bioreactor tank, essentially. So.
Another idea I think that has gained traction over the past decade is taking taking inputs that otherwise would maybe be harmful and putting into and feeding kind of the system. I think basically what you're doing, Lisa, is essentially, I've heard called gas fermentation as an example. It's basically taking, maybe CO2 as an input and helping to grow protein and helping to kind of make it a little more of a circular economy. Can you talk about that? Is that kind of a macro trend that we're going to see more and more of?
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, who's had a soda today or sparkling water? So we're consuming CO2 all the time, but this is a way of taking it and making a protein out of elements in the air that we breathe right now. Oxygen, nitrogen, and CO2 are all elements of the air. We're breathing out CO2 as we speak. And that's really what the scientists at NASA were thinking about. The astronauts are breathing out the carbon. Let's capture that and then put it into this system that can turn it into a nutrient, and then the astronauts would eat that and then breathe out the carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and create essentially a closed loop carbon cycle. So yeah, I think the more that we can reuse and mimic nature, because that is of course what our plants do, they just take too long, essentially. They take longer to do that than the amount of CO2 that we're pumping into the atmosphere. That's sort of the problem that we're facing with climate change.
Sanah, I think I've always felt like the transfer of research and kind of the funding that goes into the research and how that ultimately trickles down into industry is a bit of a black box for just the journeyman, every person. Could you possibly explain how some of the funding that is, or some of the research that's spinning out of the funding that the Biden administration is doing ultimately will end up into industry that will feed novel proteins, new types of food that find our way to our plates and to startups, et cetera. Can you explain how that's going to happen a little bit?
Yeah, no,
that's a lot to.
I appreciate the question, and I want to add really quickly on the biomanufacturing, bioeconomy front. The President Biden did issue a historic executive order, talking about growing the domestic bioeconomy, called for a series of bold goals report. I encourage everybody to check out the bold goals report that USDA in partnership with the federal family, through the input of a lot of stakeholders, especially from the alt protein world, put out to say, here's where we need to go, right? This is it's a series of value-based, ambitious documents. We're hoping that certain folks on other parts of government are listening and saying, hey, we really need to back it up. As I mentioned, public investment in ag R&D is critically important. So we're really just signaling that this is a really new and important area of innovation that we need to invest in. And I mentioned we've done it for a long time. Over the past couple of years, it's been wonderful to get funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, the biggest piece of climate legislation in our nation's history, as well as the infrastructure bill and the American Rescue Plan. So we've leveraged that money to do really creative things. Kind of thinking about the producer-facing element of how do we bring consortiums of producer organizations, technical assistance providers, academics together, and really kind of create these little mini climate incubation labs to measure, monitor, evaluate, really how are these practices on the ground around translating into sequestration? How do we build that value proposition around a climate smart label? All of that is driven by science and technology. All of that ultimately will be what consumers will trust because they know that it's verified. But it's a constant cycle of kind of working with local, regional producers, bringing them to the table, and also making sure that we have you all coming to the table and saying, hey, are you all doing any investments in whatever the technology might be, whether it's more of that on the ag tech side, more on the precision fermentation, and even more of kind of what Lisa is doing. But NIFA, which is our National Institute of Food and Agriculture, is the biggest extramural funding, research funding agency for agriculture, I think, in the world, if not the biggest, one of the biggest. So that $2 billion of funding. Take a look at the Agriculture Food Research Initiative, AFRI, which is a major Farm Bill program, which, by the way, is up. Farm Bill is up again, being talked about by Congress. That is an opportunity to fund real innovation. You can apply for that funding. You can, be able to catalyze and prove out your technology, and then you can help, be able to get it commercialized. So there are, I would just say, people don't maybe recognize the number, the diversity of funding opportunities out there, as well as the fact that all of this information, all this research, like I mentioned, is publicly available. You can go into our systems and look at a grant to, the Iowa State University, which is doing a lot on biomanufacturing, and seeing exactly what we funded through research and turn that into a company. And I think that commercialization, again, we want that. We really want that. That is actually one of the measures of success is, how far did our research funding go? Has it sparked new companies and entrepreneurship?
Either Maria or Lisa, when you were building your companies, have you looked towards some of the research out in the broader domain, maybe stuff that's been funded by the government and the Biden administration, and say, hey, I can tap into that? I'm just kind of curious to flip it to the other side, how you're leveraging some of this innovation and research and inputting it into your company.
Or how can we do better?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. We certainly looked into ARPA-H, and I think because it's a new initiative, I think it's really great to see the support from the government. I think it's the combination of the government, the large incumbents that are supplying kind of the traditional food sources to the world, in combination with working with farmers to make this shift in the economy. And so I think just from our perspective, very early on, we didn't even realize that some of these grants were available to us. It's much more known, like in the kind of pharmaceutical space and things like that. And so now with ARPA-H and then with the additional agriculture, that funding is available. And I think that sparks the innovation that then helps larger commercial organizations that can take those products ultimately to the market and globally distribute. One of the things, TripleBar has a relationship with kind of the third largest dairy incumbent in the world, Friesland Campina out of the Netherlands, and they have the ability to take those products to market, but they didn't have the innovation pieces to kind of start that process. And that's where TripleBar can come in on the kind of creating the organisms that can be scaled up for fermentation. And I can see a role in government for sure to be able to help spark some of the kind of critical pieces of innovation that's required to use organisms to make products or cell lines to make products. And I think the community as a whole, I've seen a shift in the food industry going away from this, what you call the not invented here syndrome. There's everyone wants to be vertically integrated, create a thing, and then put a product on the shelf. We're not going to be able to hit our goals by 2050 if everybody's doing that. There's not going to be 27 forms of chicken. We need to kind of come together, both government, large incumbents, and the innovative community to really get those products to market faster. So so definitely have seen and tapped into some of that, and appreciate the work that you're doing and the advocacy in that space. And we need to really make sure that folks are aware of what's available out there, because I don't think we were. So yeah. But Lisa, how about you?
Yeah, no, I see this as a moment that's similar to, over a decade ago when we had the first version of climate tech called clean tech. That first boom, there was a lot of investor activity, a lot of venture investments in many companies, and then various factors happened and that investment kind of went away, but government stepped in, regulatory, et cetera, and we went from those first solar panels to now solar is kind of the leading source of energy.
And cheaper.
it's cheaper, and all the new installments are solar, or others. But renewable energy is really what's being installed now. So that has happened, and similarly, we're at a moment where we need the government to invest in this space to scale some of these many innovations that venture investors have invested in and entrepreneurs have started, and research bodies, USDA and others kind of did that basic fundamental research that then was taken to companies. In our case, we currently are working with the Department of Defense, with DARPA, that program, because we have a way of making food that's essentially off the grid. Not necessarily off the grid, but off the supply chain. So you can actually just make this food anywhere with just elements of the air, water, and energy as your inputs, which really applies for food security issues, kind of addressing food security, as well as, disaster relief areas, humanitarian crises. You can take essentially a mobile unit in, and you can make food, in a matter of hours with this type of technology. So that's why we're working with them on that. But there's, this is a great opportunity with the BioManufacturing initiative, as well as some of the decarbonization funding that you talked about.
Well, thank you. I'm so excited to hear that you're well connected with the high risk, high reward funding sources, right, through HHS, through Department of Defense. We have one at agriculture called AGARDA, authorized in the Farm Bill at $50 million. We've only received about $2 million to date. So it's a little bit of a different story in agriculture, which is why, public-public partnerships are important. So glad you are super savvy there. But I did want to mention that scaling, of course, is one thing that we know is a huge, huge challenge. And I think an area where it's been a little bit of maybe a tougher fit to see for food biomanufacturing, although USDA is working on this, right? We have a great track record of what we've been able to do for bioenergy and biofuels, and being able to support a lot of the CapEx costs and steel in the ground for those types of facilities. We're really looking at how do we expand eligibility? How do we make sure that entrepreneurs like you, companies like you that are leading the future of food, can also avail these critical opportunities available right now through our rural development mission area. And there have been, just in the past couple of months, a couple of examples of us providing that patient capital, that at very low interest rates, to be able to build out precision fermentation manufacturing facilities. And I really hope that we get to see a lot more of that in the future.
I think it's important that you mentioned that as well, because I think the community has really thought, oh, well, we're going to go to venture to get the money to make a facility. And that's really not the role of venture, right? The role of venture is to innovate and then work with, government on some of these earlier, grant funding opportunities, non-dilutive funding, and that's where innovation goes. But then venture is trying to come up with new ideas like, oh, let's take, leverage the IP and then give you a loan against that. And it's not really the best way to create it. So, hearing that is actually really exciting, that there are going to be available loans and things low interest. And I think that's what really is going to set the stage for making these proteins more available. And kind of going back to what Lisa was saying, and I know we talked about this kind of before the panel on, thinking about how can we make food in kind of a location that food is needed. And I think both what Lisa's doing and then in the alternative protein space, having bioreactors in areas that are densely populated, or areas that maybe don't have access to proteins.
Meat breweries, your local meat brewery.
Exactly, meat breweries. And making those products kind of like at the source, and so that it doesn't have to fly across the globe or fly across the world. Think of the carbon reduction there. We don't really talk about that stuff, but I think that really does make an impact.
You bring up the opportunity to talk about. Do you want to say something?
Just really quickly too, and that also I think will help bridge that divide that we're seeing around traditional agriculture and more of like kind of the newer folks, right? If they're being placed in the heartland, which is something I'm really excited about. Actually, is a lot of the kind of players that are ready for commercial scale are now looking at Chicago, Illinois, Indiana, and I think being closer as well to where the inputs for a lot of these products are coming from just makes perfect sense. Yeah. And then you realize that a lot of agriculture and farm communities are actually very food insecure, so it helps feed multiple birds with one stone.
I'm glad you bring that up, of bringing manufacturing closer to the people. The idea of meat breweries. In our pre-call, we had this. We actually said, someone brought up how close. A great topic would be, how close are we to the Star Trek Replicator? And so when I first heard about the bioreactor creating protein out of thin air, I thought, Lisa, man, wouldn't that be great to have in my house, just pumping out protein? But I also thought putting something like that in food insecure communities in places that are like not just food deserts, but actual deserts. We can create protein just out of thin air. It sounds like an exciting thing. So let's talk about that. How close are we to these types of technologies where we can actually create food in a highly distributed sense, maybe using bioreactors, but also like kind of food printers using inputs? Is this something that's still science fiction, or is this going to be realizable in our next couple of years?
It's coming. It's happening. There are companies that are commercializing now. We're in the early stages, of course. We're in the stage where a lot of venture money has gone into this to try to get it to that first kind of critical milestone, and we're going to need that scale-up capital to come into the industry so that we can actually build these systems. But yeah, 3D printing, what we do, what you guys are talking about, where you're using kind of agricultural inputs, and then you're creating these cells with these fermenters, and then in our case, we're using the elements of those agricultural inputs to create ingredients. But yeah, we're at a exciting moment, I'd say, because of the interest and the entrepreneurial energy and the innovation, and that's going to lead to a new future, and a future that's required. I mean, we have 8 billion people on the planet. We currently have cleared an amount of land equivalent to South America and Africa combined for the agricultural system as a whole, the food processing system. So how are we going to feed 10 billion people by 2050? So we need more of these solutions that require less land, less water, and that are climate friendly.
I mean, the U.S. has been one of the most progressive in terms of allowing for and giving the regulatory environment for gene editing, gene-edited food. I think Europe's trying to catch up to a certain extent. We talked about this a little bit in the speaker ready room, but I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on like how important genomics are in gene editing, CRISPR-based tools to create that next crop, because climate change, quite honestly, is going to make it hard to grow certain crops in certain regions. We may not be able to grow coffee in Costa Rica 10 years from now. We're going to need these tools, right? So how important are these tools, and where do you see like the government's role?
So important. Can I just to think about, the point that I made around yield and shifting from just a hyper focus on producing as much as we can. Now we have the opportunity to harness biotechnology, gene editing, and we are, right, to really think about the nutrients and nutrient density, and really making, helping specialty crops be as absolutely delicious as they possibly can be with, the least amount of water, and also, building in traits of disease resistance and pest resistance, which we know are going to be increasingly challenging as the planet warms, as we have new insects coming, and as we can no longer grow, right, the same things in the same area. So it's definitely something that is a huge area of opportunity, and one where I'm actually seeing a lot of great innovation and thoughtfulness coming from our universities. They're really leading the charge here. I encourage you all to take a look at, for example, what Tufts University is doing. USDA actually funded Tufts National Institute of Cellular Agriculture through the AFRE program, which I just mentioned, $10 million, first ever investment in cellular agriculture innovation. I'll be there tomorrow to talk more about this, but I'm really seeing Purdue University, I don't want to name names, but for folks who are interested, take a look at some of what they're doing. And I love the fact that it's not just the agriculture departments or the animal science or food science. They're bringing in the engineering departments, right? They're bringing in computer science, all of these, interdisciplinary approaches that they can really, also attract that talent that we know is so critical.
Yeah, shout out to my home state of Washington. I think Washington State had the first gene-edited pig that was approved for human consumption.
That was ARS research.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of companies that are venture funded that are actually bringing gene-edited crops to market now, like the Parawises of the world, who actually was here last year at CES. So, but I'd like to, in the last few minutes, just kind of maybe put our futurist hat on and think a little bit about technologies we're most excited about. And I'll kind of go down the row here and start with you, Lisa. Maybe you could talk about some of the technologies you're most excited about that maybe the average person hasn't heard about, that'll really translate science fiction into our plate and help feed more people in the future.
It's a good question. What has the average person heard about? I'm not sure. But I want to talk about something slightly different, which is important in this industry, which is packaging. So as we get all this food out to ourselves, to consumers, to the 8 billion people on this planet, there's a lot of waste that's involved in that process. There's a lot of plastic that ends up in the middle of the ocean. And so there's a lot of people that are working on how do you make packaging more efficient, and how do you make it biodegradable? So I'd say that that's kind of a key area that we really need innovation in order to, feed this planet in a way that doesn't break the planet.
Maria?
Yeah, I guess, the products that I think that are in TripleBar is creating inputs into these particular products. I don't think folks are thinking about, okay, I'm going to eat a chicken breast that was made from a bioreactor, and ooh, that's scary, and that's GMO. I'm going to be, a little bit provocative and say, give me GMO all day, every day, and I will put it in my body and I will eat it because it is safe, and we've been using it
for many decades.
And so I'm a pro GMOer. But I think thinking about, could we actually have, we talked about that food replicator, right? Could we create little vials of cells that could be, give the carbon inputs or air inputs or water inputs that then we could make a steak, in our house in 7 minutes or something like that. There are kind of various, parts of that value chain that exists. And I think one of the key things that's going to be important is for those companies to come together, being supported by government and public companies that are making products and actually make this thing a reality. So it's going to require that ecosystem to truly be working towards that goal of 2050. And look, if we do cool things and we make cool products, everyone's going to make money and the world's going to be a better place. So.
Amen. And just to build on what Lisa mentioned too, biomanufacturing is about a whole range of things, including making products from natural sources. So one of the major initiatives that we have underway is creating a more circular economy and taking agricultural waste, turning that into fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel is like one of the biggest challenge areas that we're partnering with transportation and others to push forward. And that is also a huge opportunity, again, to keep wealth in rural areas that we know need it. Like, we need to move away from that extraction economy. We need to help make sure that they can be profitable through all of the different income streams and opportunities available. The other thing I think is, I totally agree with what you said, Maria. I think in thinking about the future, it's not really technology. I don't want to pick a favorite technology, or there's so many things out there that I'm really passionate about. But I think one thing that needs to happen is that we need to make sure that we keep all of these new foods in the realm of deliciousness. People don't want to eat technology, right? That's kind of where things went awry with GMOs and gene editing. How do we communicate that in a very trusting way? And I think this new industry, this novel food industry, is really trying to do that and be very thoughtful on the front end. But I think that there are a range of storytellers that need to be out there to help communicate trust and to help communicate the other value propositions actually beyond climate, because we're actually seeing that most people, although they say that they want to buy, with sustainability in mind, they're still driven by price, by taste, and by convenience, at least in the United States, right? One area where we do see folks are, maybe be willing to spend more is on health and on nutrition. So how do we be able to kind of carve these stories together in a way that also prioritizes that people eat because it's fun, it's cultural, and it's an opportunity to connect, and not something that's kind of, removed from reality.
Well, what's important too, it doesn't have to taste the same as what we're traditionally used to. I mean, I think about plant-based milk is probably the product that's had the most kind of market, traction of alternative proteins. And look, soy milk tastes good, oat milk tastes good. It's not milk. And so, tasting different but still tasting delicious is also okay. And I think that will really help with consumer adoption as well.
Oh my gosh, so many great points just made, like the fact that we don't need to create the exact analog, we could create new things. The fact that these different components need to be brought together through more collaboration to ultimately create these great new things. I love that. And your point about information, I think food is like one of these areas where there's a lot of bad information, a lot of misinformation. It's become increasingly politicized, and there should be a whole nother panel on that we'll invite you back for next year, but I don't think we have time for that. But I just want to thank you all for having such a great conversation on stage. This has been a really enlightening panel, so I just wanted you guys to give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much, guys. This has been great.
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate it. That was awesome.
Thanks, Mike.